do appreciate all of your being here. I always like to start by saying that whether I'm speaking with groups of mental health professionals or teachers or parents, that typically people would be listening in what I call two-part harmony. So you may be here this evening to think about issues that have come up with your children, and that's perfectly okay. But you may also be here this evening thinking about things that come up for you or for your spouse, and that's okay too. And I also always like to point out that if that is the case, that you're in good company, because I do consider myself to be a recovering perfectionist. And I'll say a couple of things about that as we go along this evening. We're going to be talking about the psychology of perfectionism, what it is, where it comes from, and given my particular point of view about it, about where it comes from, then that's going to tell us something about what to do about it, how to help somebody get beyond it and become what I do call a recovering perfectionist. And if I had to boil the psychology of perfectionism down to a single phrase, this would be it. What does it mean if I make a mistake? We're going to be talking a lot about meaning this evening, psychologically, so we'll get into that. But basically, if you're the kind of person who makes a mistake and you think to yourself, okay, I'm disappointed about that, and I don't like making mistakes, but I'll learn something from it, and I'll see if I can do better next time, then probably you're not a perfectionist. If you're the kind of person who makes a mistake and gets very upset about it, though, and as we'll see in a few minutes, if you're the kind of person who thinks, okay, this means that there's really something wrong with me, and it also means that I'm not quite acceptable as a person, then you're in the vicinity of perfectionism. We live, unfortunately, in a perfectionistic culture, and this is one of the things that makes it difficult to do something about perfectionism. And the example that I usually like to use about that is the Olympics. So if you've watched the Olympics on television, and you're watching an awards ceremony, and the three podia are up there, and they're giving the bronze and the silver and the gold medals, if you listen to the story that's being told about that, it isn't going to be a story about the three best athletes in history in this particular race or event or whatever it is, who came within fractions of a second or fractions of a millimeter of each other. Typically, the story you're going to be hearing is a story about the gold medalists and the losers. If you're a perfectionist, that's your worst nightmare. And the reason for that is that the message, if you're a perfectionist, is you're either perfect or you're worthless. So we have these stories in our culture about people who tried so hard, just didn't make it. And we have that story even if they just didn't make it by fractions of a second in the Olympics, where everybody is an outstanding athlete. But still, that's the story. And so that's what we're up against when we're talking about doing something about perfectionism. So in order to understand this and understand what's going on, I'm going to tell you a story about a young woman that I have done therapy with. I'll call her Ava. That's not her real name. And some of the facts in the story that I'll tell you are actually changed to protect her privacy. But when I first met Ava, she was a high schooler. She had always been a straight A student. She had lots of good friends who were very gifted, and she was identified as a gifted student. She had a pretty easy time of it in school, and the reason I met her is because her parents were beginning to be concerned about something that was going on for her, which is that her grades were beginning to fall. She was starting to get somewhat withdrawn, and she was pulling away from her friends. and getting into arguments with them and so forth. And these are friends that she had had since early elementary school. So the family came in, and I listened to the story. And as I say, the history of this was that she had always done extremely well, and now she wasn't doing well. And another part of the story was that up to now, she had pretty much breezed through all the work that she'd been doing, but this particular year, she had taken a significant number of advanced placement and honors courses. And for Ava, it wasn't just about the courses. Ava traditionally and historically had been involved in other kinds of activities. In this particular year, she was in the school orchestra. She was the editor of the school newspaper. And she also had organized a volunteer effort in the church community that she and her family belonged to. It was a social justice program that was going on, which was taking a significant amount of time. So, in other words, Ava was pretty busy. And because of the advanced placement and honors courses that she just enrolled in, she was discovering that there wasn't enough time in the day to get all the work done in the way that she wanted to have it done. And this was affecting her pretty hard. And so she was getting withdrawn and not doing as well in school and so forth. I'm going to tell you a couple of parts of her story as we go along here, but that sets the stage for what I want to tell you about what perfectionism looks like. And to do that, so I always forget my humor. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about in our culture. You've all heard of helicopter parents and so forth, I'm sure. I'm going to put some lists up here. They're on your handout. And we're going to talk about what perfectionism looks like from the outside. So I'll be talking about perfectionistic behaviors and thoughts that many perfectionists have and feelings that many of them have. Now, a disclaimer about these lists, they're not necessarily exhaustive. There may be other things that perfectionists do that don't happen to appear on this list. Not everybody who does things on this list is perfectionistic. So in general, if you're looking at this list and you're thinking about your child or about yourself or your spouse, the more you see that person on this list, the more likely it is that perfectionism is part of the picture. So I want to talk about just a couple of the things on this list. The first one is Ava. This is kind of the stereotypical perfectionist in our culture. It's the person who does everything and has to do everything well, and who is totally overloaded and totally overcommitted and many times exhausted and upset. That's Ava. Some perfectionists are the kinds of people who will get places late because they find a whole bunch of things that need to be done on their way out of the house. That would be me at a somewhat earlier part of my life. I've recovered a bit from that. But so I know what this is about. So you're on your way out the door, and there's a couple of things that you know need to be done, and they're going to be waiting for you when you get home. And so you've got a few extra minutes, after all. And so you might as well go ahead and get those things done, because why have them hanging over your head or have to do them when you walk back in the door? And so you start doing that. And if you're a perfectionist, you also don't start doing something and not finish it. Okay, so you're doing these things and you finish them up, and oh, by the way, now that I'm doing this, I might as well do this also. It's a really small thing, but it would get that out of the way also. And that goes on and on until you're late. Now, perfectionists are not all the same. And so perfectionism comes in a number of different flavors. And there are some perfectionists who would be exactly the opposite of what I just described. They're the kinds of people who would never get someplace late under any circumstances, and in fact they're going to leave the house early. And so if any of these things are going to be done, they're going to be done way earlier, or they will be left for later on, and then they'll be done perfectly. So there are some perfectionists who won't get anywhere late, and that's just a different version of the same kind of thing. Perfectionists are the kind of people who frequently will pay a whole lot more attention to negative comments than to positive ones. And so if you're doing a performance or you're doing a presentation or something like that, and 50 people come up to you at the end and say, hey, this was fantastic and wonderful, I learned a great deal from it, I'm really thrilled you were here, and one person says, yeah, it was okay. If you're a perfectionist, you will be up at 3 in the morning wondering what that person meant. And you also probably will have forgotten everything else that was said. The last thing on the list sometimes is surprising to people is procrastination. Not all perfectionists procrastinate. Again, like what I was saying earlier, many perfectionists wouldn't think about handing anything in late. They'll usually get it in early. But some perfectionists do procrastinate. Not all procrastinators are perfectionists, but some perfectionists, and so, for example, some high schoolers that I've spoken with, when you talk to them about what's going on for them, it begins to become clear that some kids will find it easier to get into big arguments with their parents and their teachers than to do a project and hand it in and take the risk of making something less than an A. And this is very powerful. And the feeling for some of these people who are perfectionistic that they may do less than perfect work is so overwhelming that sometimes they'll put off doing it, and sometimes they'll put off doing it until way past the deadline. So those are some perfectionistic behaviors. Here's another humorous take on that. I finished my New Year's resolutions, and now I'm going to get a running start on yours. The next list is thoughts that some perfectionists have. All of us have in internal self-talk. We have things we tell ourselves about, the kind of person we should be, who we are, how we fit in with other people, what other people think about us. We're constantly going over this in our minds, even if not explicitly. And sometimes it's not spelled out in language, but there are these messages that we have and that we live by. So for perfectionists, sometimes the message is, I should be able to do everything, and I should be able to do everything very well. And so, for example, we'll see some gifted kids who do very well academically in school, but who will sit on the bench on the sidelines in the athletic field and not try. And for some of those kids, if you talk to them, you find out that what's going on is that in their mind, they're telling themselves, if I'm going to get out there on the field and risk making an idiot out of myself, I better know what I'm doing, and I should get out on the field and know everything there is about the game, all the moves and all the strategies and everything else. And furthermore, if I am really who I think I need to be, I should be able to do that without studying it, without putting in effort. Learning curves are not for perfectionists. Perfectionists are frequently people who feel that things should be done right the first time. So again, no learning curves. They should be able to go out and do whatever it is that they're going to do right the first time. And there's a couple of items on this list that I'm going to put a lot of stress on this evening as we go on here. One of these is the self-talk message that I'm never good enough. A lot of perfectionists end up believing this about themselves. This is part of their internal self-talk. I'm never good enough. No matter how hard I try, it isn't good enough. And the other thing that frequently perfectionists will think is, if I mess something up, it means that there's something wrong with me. So back to this issue about what it means to make a mistake, for a perfectionist, frequently the meaning of that is their sense of reality about themselves is that if they goof something up, it means that there is something wrong with them. And the last list is a list of feelings that frequently go along with perfectionism. Perfectionists are frequently the kinds of people who end up being really disgusted or angry with themselves when they get criticized. It's very embarrassing to get criticized. There's a lot of anxiety involved with that. We're going to see why as we go on. Sometimes perfectionists are the kinds of people who get angry and upset. They have routines that they do to help them get through and make sure that things are going to be done well and properly. And if you come in and interrupt the routine, then there's trouble. And I'm not necessarily talking about academic routines or how to solve problems, in mathematics or something like that. I'm talking about sometimes very straightforward and simple things like get up in the morning, get your clothes on, eat your breakfast, brush your teeth. You want to make sure all of those things are done and they're done just right. And one of the ways to help with that is to develop a routine. So you get up in the morning and you launch into your routine, and then your spouse says, "Honey, will you get some milk on the way home from work tonight?" And you explode. And what we're going to see about that is that while from the outside that seems weird and irrational, what's happened at that moment is a lot of anxiety. The routine has been interrupted, and the fear and the anxiety is about, I won't be able to get these things done that I think I should get done, and they should be done well. If you do research on perfectionism and you correlate it with personality characteristics, the outstanding one that comes out of that is that perfectionists have a concern over mistakes. Now, commonly, when people talk about perfectionism, they'll talk about it as a good thing, that they'll say, I'm such a perfectionist, and they mean that they really do well, and it seems to them like their perfectionism is driving their success. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that in a few minutes, but it turns out that if you do this kind of research, the personality characteristics that's outstanding for people who are perfectionistic or tested to be perfectionistic is a concern over mistakes. And what this means is that at bottom there's a lot of anxiety and worry connected with perfectionism. Anna Quindlen, the author, when she was doing commencement ceremony at Mount Holyoke College some years ago, was talking about her own perfectionism as a freshman in college, and she referred to it as a backpack full of bricks. Some very interesting research that's been done about perfectionism was done back in the mid-'80s, and was some similar research has just come out in the last couple of years. And it turns out that if you look at people who are highly successful in various fields of endeavor, whether it's the law or graduate school, graduate students, or athletics, a whole bunch of different groups of people have been tested for this. What you end up discovering is that the people in whatever field that is who are most successful are less likely to be perfectionistic than people in the same field who are not quite as successful. Now, this is really interesting. So what this ends up meaning is that perfectionism gets in your way. And if you think about it, and you will think about perfectionism and anxiety as we go along here, because I'll say a whole lot more about that, but anxiety gets in your way. If you're more concerned about how you're doing something than you are about what it is that you're doing, that anxiety is going to interrupt you. It's going to make it more difficult to do what you can do. If you're an athlete, you can't get into the zone, you can't get into flow. Things are not automatic, and there's a lot of concern about how you're doing, and that anxiety makes you less successful, as it turns out. So there's good research support for that. There's all kinds of research that correlates perfectionism with a lot of other things as well. We know that in intimate relationships for adults, if one person is perfectionistic, there's going to be a difficulty in the intimate relationship. And one of the reasons for that, you can imagine, is that if you're a perfectionist, and so everything that you do has to be done well, and you have a partner who is doing something with you, then of course the partner has to do something well also. Because if he or she doesn't, it's a reflection on you. And so there's a lot of pressure. So you can be thinking about that as I go along here. There's some even more serious things that we know correlate with perfectionism. As suicidality, we know that there are people who have attempted suicide, and looking back on information on people who actually have committed suicide, not everybody who commits suicide is perfectionistic, but perfectionism will frequently be a part of the picture there. And so in some cases get very serious. The point about that is that there's some people who become so hopeless about ever being able to be good enough, about ever being able to be perfect in the way that they want to, that they end up being very discouraged and they give up. Depression is part of the picture there too, and that's something different, but perfectionism enters into it, and we know that from the research. So this has led a lot of people to say this phrase that sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. So perfectionism is about anxiety. And I want to make a distinction for you between perfectionism and the pursuit of excellence. And this little thing up here that I've adapted from something I found on the internet. Actually, a friend of ours who's a minister sent this around. It was part of a sermon he did. And I was going to credit him with it, but he says that he found it on the internet and he has no idea who did it. So anyway, if you look at the items on this little chart or list, you can see that perfectionism is deadening, it's controlling. That's what it's all about. And the pursuit of excellence is enlivening or enriching. You can be a person who burns the candle at both ends, who stays up all night. You can be a person who tries their best and gets very disappointed when they don't quite make their goal, or when they make a less than perfect score, or whatever it is. You can be a person like that and still not be a perfectionist. Because perfectionism isn't about being disappointed about not achieving something that you want to achieve. Perfectionism, if you want to put it this way, is about being devastated about that. Perfectionism is not about anything around pride of accomplishment. It's about a fear of failure. There is a lot of anxiety involved in it. And there's been conversation in the literature about something people call healthy perfectionism. So the first professional article that I wrote about perfectionism a few years ago, the title is "Healthy Perfectionism is an Oxymoron." So you can see where I stand on the issue. And you can't talk to a perfectionist who will tell you that their perfectionism is a good thing. Many perfectionists will tell you that because of their perfectionism, they've been successful. But they will also tell you that it's a burden and that they wish that it wasn't part of the picture for them. So Perfectionism is about the desire to be perfect, and not almost perfect, but perfect. And it's also, at the same time, about a fear of imperfection. A lot of anxiety that goes along with that. And as we'll see, it's about an emotional conviction about yourself that unless you're perfect, you're not quite acceptable as a person. So it's about the desire to be perfect, the fear of being imperfect, and the emotional conviction that the route to acceptance is making yourself perfect. And these things all go together, like the leading and trailing edges of a wing. So at the leading edge, with a perfectionist, we have a person for whom it's very important to do well. And that's great. That's the pursuit of excellence. But if you're a perfectionist, there's a trailing edge to this wing, which is, what happens to me if I'm not perfect? It's the fear of not being able to be successful and be perfect. And again, in any perfectionist's experience of themselves, those two things are inseparable. So the bright line that distinguishes between perfectionism and the pursuit of excellence is this anxiety about failing. It's about what it means to make a mistake. And if it means that there's something wrong with you, and if it means that you're not as acceptable as you want to be to other people, then perfectionism is probably part of the picture. These are Greenspon's mantras. So I had a client who was a surgeon, and he was there to talk about a number of things, about himself and about his marriage and family and so on. But one of the things we were talking about was his perfectionism. And he said at one point, "I'm afraid that if I lose my perfectionism, I'll lose my edge." So I've just told you about all of the research that we have that actually contradicts that. That if anything, perfectionism gets in your way. And he and I had long conversations about this. And as I say, there were a whole bunch of things going on for him, but that was one of the things. And I said to him, if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of your perfectionism, what I know is that, if anything, you would be better at what you do. He was a really outstanding surgeon, so it's not likely it would improve that much. But if anything, it would be better. He certainly wouldn't make him worse. And I always joke about this. I don't have a magic wand, but my wife does. And I have a crystal ball. And in the 35-plus years that we've been in private practice together, neither one of us has been able to make either one of those things work. But we still have them. But if I could wave that magic wand of hers over my client's head and get rid of his perfectionism, the reason that he wouldn't get worse at what he does is because it isn't his perfectionism that's making him as good as he is. It's his talent, it's his energy, it's his commitment. Those are the things that make people successful. There'll be other things too, but talent, energy, and commitment are certainly in the mix there, and that's what makes people successful. And if I got rid of his perfectionism, none of those things would be affected in any way. Not his talent, not his energy, not his commitment. And so we end up concluding that perfectionists who are successful not because of their perfectionism, but really despite it. So how do we get this way? First question usually is it genetic? My first answer is no. I don't know if any of you read the Wall Street Journal, and if you do, I don't know if you happen to be reading it last November-ish, sometime in there, because I was interviewed for an article because one of the writers for the Wall Street Journal had come across a study that had just been published that purported to show that perfectionism has a genetic basis. As it turns out, for reasons I won't get into because it's way too deep into the weeds, it didn't actually show that. It's kind of weird that it was published in that way, but at any rate, so I was interviewed, and so was another psychologist, and a couple of radio programs came out of that because people at NPR had seen the article in the Wall Street Journal and so forth, and so we had some ongoing conversation about that for the first few months of, or few weeks of this year, I guess. But my attitude about that is that no, it isn't genetic. First of all, if you take a look at those lists that I put up about the behaviors and thoughts and feelings, I don't know if there's any geneticists in the audience. I'm not one of them. But still, it's hard for me to conceive of a gene that would turn all of that on. Now, it certainly is true that some components of some people's perfectionism might be genetically based. To the extent that you're a perfectionist and you're highly anxious, the anxiety that's part of the perfectionism may have a genetic inflow. And persistence or temperamental factors like that, and many perfectionists are very persistent because they want to be perfect, that may have some sort of genetic basis. But by and large, this is way too complex and develops over a period of time in a way that I'm going to describe to you. So my answer is no, it isn't genetic. So if that's the case, then where does it come from? Perfectionism is not a mental disorder. It's not like depression or anxiety disorders or eating disorders. But interestingly enough, frequently those things will go along with perfectionism, and the research shows that when they do, so for example, you have a person with an eating disorder, and they're trying to sculpt the perfect body, so they're anorexic, basically, and not eating. If they're perfectionistic, and not all anorexics are perfectionistic, but if an eating disorder and perfectionism go together, you have to treat both of them because each one of them makes the other one harder to deal with. And we know that about eating disorders, we know it about depression, we know it about obsessive-compulsive disorder, we know it about general anxiety disorders. So they are separate things, but sometimes can run on parallel tracks. So to get into my thoughts about where perfectionism comes from, I'll tell you the second part of the story about Ava, and that is where she comes from. So Ava comes from a home in which her parents are extremely bright, very high-energy people in general. Both of them are lawyers. Ava's mother retired from her law practice to raise Ava and her sister, so she had been doing that, and along the way had also been experiencing some depression. It turns out that Ava's parents were in therapy with me, as well as Ava being, and I'll talk some more about that in a second too. But her mother had been experiencing some depression, and so therefore was a bit emotionally detached. Her father, Ava's father, was a law professor and had an international reputation, did a lot of traveling, and so he was gone a lot, physically out of the house a lot. And then when he would come home, he would traditionally do something, which is he would pose questions to members of the family to see if they could get the answers to these questions. And it was all very sophisticated and very pointed questions and everything. And the idea was that he was going to trip you up and see if he could ask you a question that you couldn't get the answer to. And it turns out that over the years that he had been doing this, it began to occur to Ava, and not in so many words in her mind, but this is part of what her experience was, that if she was going to maintain a connection with her father, and that if she was going to have him like her, that the best way to do that was to be really outstanding at answering all of his questions correctly. And her father, even though he was physically gone a lot, was the one who emotionally was more available when he was there, and so Ava aimed her energy at him. So let's get into that a little bit deeper, and let me give you my 50-cent lecture about human psychology. And let me talk just very briefly about meaning, emotions, and connections. Every moment of our waking lives, and in some ways even when we're asleep, we are making sense of the world in a certain way. You have a consistent understanding of who you are over time. You feel coherent, and by that I mean you feel like a unitary person. And you also have some sense of the rationale for what you're doing. You all know, for example, why you're here tonight, and you know how to do this. The thought of coming to hear somebody talk to you about something is a thought that you've encountered before, and so you know how to do that. It all makes sense to you, and it turns out that our world of experience, always makes sense to us every moment of every day. And so if you think about waking up in the middle of the night with a terrifying dream, what's typically happening there is that the imagery in that dream doesn't make sense in the same way that it would in waking life. It's very strange and mysterious. And it turns out that if it doesn't make sense, that can be downright terrifying and certainly disorienting. And that's why nightmares are so scary. And so it's because it moves into some different reality, which is very disorienting. So the world always has some meaning for us. And if you're a perfectionist, for example, a mistake means there's something wrong with you. Now, understand something here. This is basic human psychology. Ava's sense of reality is that if she makes a mistake, it means her father won't like her, and it means that there's something deficient about her. That's what she thinks is the reality. And while we stand outside of her and can say, like, well, that can't be the case, it doesn't make sense to us, we have to understand that it's what makes sense to Ava if we're going to ever help her, and we'll get into that. The second thing is that our motivation in life is based on finding ways to basically manage our emotions. We're always dealing with our emotional life. We're always seeking pleasurable experiences. We're always looking to avoid painful or uncomfortable experiences. We're always looking for solace when we grieve. We're looking for affirmation when we're excited about something. And to the extent that other people will respond to us in these connecting ways, and supportive and affirming and validating ways, then to that extent our self-esteem is good, we feel like we belong, and we feel acceptable, we feel good about ourselves. Ava and other perfectionists spend a good deal of their time trying to manage the anxiety about being imperfect. If you look at it this way, it's the reason perfectionists struggle to be perfect. What they're trying to do is to overcome or outdistance the anxiety about being imperfect. That's why they push themselves so hard. And that's what Ava is doing. And the third element of human psychology that I want to talk about is connections. Human beings were never big enough or strong enough or fast enough to survive in an evolutionary sense unless they banded together. That's what we did to survive and then to go on and build civilizations. That's how we did that. There's a particular kind of connection that we make, an empathic connection, and I'll talk more about empathy in a few minutes. But we make these bonds with one another, and so it's crucially important to us to feel accepted and acceptable to others. If we don't feel acceptable, then it's very uncomfortable, for one thing, and for another thing, if we don't feel acceptable, then a mistake is not just a mistake. It makes us very vulnerable, and it seems more to be a sign of a personal flaw. And this sense of connection is crucially important to us in our development, psychological and emotional development, throughout our whole lives. We never outgrow this. We are made to be connected to one another. And in these horrific orphanage studies that were done, especially after the Second World War, but also more recently, we know that you can raise infants in an orphanage and you can keep them fed and nourished and safe and comfortable, but if there's no human contact, they experience what the pediatricians call a failure to thrive. And that is sometimes fatal. And the deal is, what's missing for them is that sense of human connection. And that's vitally important as in infancy. It's even important for flat-out brain development. We now know that the human brain develops according to the nature of the connections that the infant is able to make with adult caregivers, such as parents and so forth. And so these connections are crucial to us, and for Ava, that's one of the reasons that she put so much effort and energy into getting all of the answers correct, is because she was trying to establish and maintain a sense of connection with her father. So there are a number of family situations in which perfectionism can arise. There are some families that are hypercritical. These are families that criticize everybody all the time, criticize the neighbors, criticize the relatives, maybe even criticize the people within the family. But one way or another, there is all sorts of criticism, and under those circumstances, some kids, not all, there isn't any universal path to psychological development for human beings. So some kids won't react this way, but some kids, under those circumstances, will do their best to be above criticism. In other words, to make themselves perfect. And the idea they have, their emotional conviction, is that in order to avoid criticism, I need to make myself perfect. There's some families who the parent educators call push-pull families. These are families where the child comes home with 780 out of 800 on the SATs, and all they hear is what happened to the other 20 points. When I was writing my first book, I was sitting around with the editorial staff at Free Spirit, and we were talking about this, and one of the people on the staff said, you know, it's really interesting. I remember when I was applying to college, this is a woman who is a very successful professional with Free Spirit Publishing, and she said, when I applied to colleges, I applied to a whole bunch of small liberal arts colleges, and I got into the one that I really wanted to get into, and I was really thrilled about it. And I told my father about it, and he said, well, it's not the Ivies. It's interesting that one of the places where perfectionism is talked about a lot is in the chemical dependency recovery movement, and in organizations like Adult Children of Alcoholics. If any of you are familiar with that, there's a lot of talk of perfectionism there. In families and where there's a lot of chaos or emotional dysfunction, where there's drinking or where there's violence or those kinds of things, sometimes the outcome of that for some of the kids in the family is perfectionism. And if you think about the origins of that, it turns out to be the case that some kids under those circumstances are saying, there's got to be a way for me to do so well that my parents are going to be so proud of me that they're going to stop drinking, or they're going to stop fighting, or they'll stop being so angry, or they'll stop doing whatever it is that they're doing. And there are other reasons why this develops as well. So, for example, in some families like this, sometimes kids will go outside the family and, be straight A students, or they'll be the captain of the football team or whatever. And because they're doing so well out there, that will be the one place in their lives where they feel good about themselves, where there's somebody there who's important to them, an important adult, who is affirming them and validating them, and where they feel they can belong. Whereas at home, it's way too chaotic, and you never know whether something bad is going to happen. And so they're out there making themselves perfect, because basically that's where they can feel good about themselves. And the other thing about that is that while they're out there busying themselves with all of these activities and making themselves perfect, it's a good way not to have to deal with the emotional chaos that they experience as soon as they walk in the door. And so those are other examples of ways in which perfectionism can come out of a family context. Generally, whenever there is what the psychologists refer to as conditional acceptance in the home, I love you as long as you ... fill in the blank, where it seems like my parents love me because I'm a straight A student, or they love me because I am the star basketball player, or they love me because I'm first chair flute in the orchestra. Anytime those conditions exist, then the groundwork is laid for perfectionism. And again, not all kids will turn out perfectionistic, but that's where some of them will come from. Question is whether giftedness and perfectionism go together. And the answer to that is not necessarily. In some circles, it seems fashionable to say that perfectionism is part of being gifted. It really isn't. And in fact, when Christy Neumeister, she's a professor at Ball State who does a lot of really good research on perfectionism, she and I looked into the literature about this a few years ago, and we talked about it at the National Association for Gifted Children, NAGC. There is no evidence that giftedness and perfectionism necessarily correlate with one another, and in fact, the only really good study that was done looking at this question found that there was actually no correlation. But there are a variety of reasons why gifted kids may turn out to be perfectionistic. One of these is that if perfectionism is part of the picture for a gifted child, so a gifted child spends most of his or her time in school where they're able at least to have a shot at being perfect, and so they put a lot of energy and effort into that, more so than if they would if they were not gifted, because they would have less of a shot at perfection then. And so that's one of the reasons why some gifted kids will be perfectionistic. And another one, of course, is that many times gifted kids come from families with very high expectations and a lot of pressure to do well. And this is back to what we were talking about culturally here, and obviously we live in this society where it's very important to do your best, and starting from elementary school so you can get into the best middle school, the best high school, the best college, have the best career, on and on and on. There's a lot of pressure along these lines, and the unfortunate outcome of that is that for some kids, they will become perfectionistic, thinking that if they can't be perfect, they are not going to be acceptable. So, all in all, perfectionism is a self-esteem issue. And what that means is that perfectionists are people, as I've said, who believe that if they make a mistake, it means something is wrong with them. So perfectionists feel flawed in some way, inherently. And their self-esteem is low. Perfectionists are people who worry that they're not as acceptable as they would like to be. So if this is the case, then it's going to turn out to be that there is no sort of toggle switch that we can use to turn perfectionism off. If it's a self-esteem issue, this is why I say that overcoming perfectionism is a recovery process. It isn't like fixing a leaky faucet. It's more like allowing flowers to grow. And that is a process that takes place over time. So I'll introduce you to that by giving you the last part of the vignette about Ava. And this is about a session that Ava had with her parents. So Ava and I talked several times about having her parents come in with her. Because she had talked to me about what it's like in the home and what Dad does and all these things, and I suggested, that sounds like the kind of thing that would be really useful to talk about all together. And she invited them in, and they did come, and we had a rather amazing session, which I will describe to you. First of all, when we get together under these circumstances, this is just how I do psychotherapy. We're not looking for who's at fault here. This is nobody's fault. It's not to blame someone. We're asking a question in Ava's family. How did things get to where they got to? Who played a role in that? How did that work? Because if we know that, then that tells us what we need to do to put it on a different track. And the good news is that's always a possibility. It's always something that can be done. But we need to understand it, and we need to understand what's going on for Ava and what's happening in her life. So she invited her parents in, and with a great deal of courage, she said to her father, here's the deal. One of the things I've always been bothered by is how you come home and ask us all these questions and everything, and it's a lot of fun when I get all the answers right and all that, but I always have had the feeling that I really should do that, and that if I don't, that you won't like me as much. So Ava's dad, and in part because we had been talking about things sort of related to this in the therapy that he was doing himself, but in part also because he had a certain level of courage to do this, listened to Ava and was very thoughtful about this and said, I get that. You're right, that is what I do. And then he apologized to Ava. He said, I'm really sorry that I do that, and I think what I need to do is to figure out how to do something differently. Okay? So that was very impactful for Ava because she felt heard and she felt listened to, and she felt like she was important enough to her father to be listened to. There were all kinds of messages that went along with that. And so we had a conversation about this and went on for a few sessions. And again, because of some of the things that her dad was thinking about, on his own, we discovered something that was amazing. And it has to do with what in psychology we refer to as a disjunction. And what that means is that it turns out that this little interaction between Ava and her dad, where he's asking questions and she's giving the answers to it, she had an entirely different view of that than he did. It meant something different to her than it did to him. What it meant to Ava was, unless I get the answers to the questions right, my dad won't like me as much. And her father, as it turns out, had grown up in a home where his father was very demanding and very autocratic and very authoritarian and insisted on absolute perfection from all of his children. And the net effect of that was that one of the things that Ava's dad wanted to prove to his father, who, by the way, at that time had already passed away, but this is still going on in his mind, one of the things he wanted to prove to his father was that he was a good father, Ava's dad, because he raised very bright children. So when Ava's dad asked these questions and was looking for answers, he was looking for proof of his own worth as a person. if I've got kids who can answer these questions, that means they're bright, and that means I'm worthwhile, and that means I'm okay with my father. Ava, meanwhile, again, the same interaction, but it meant something entirely different to her. What it meant to her was, if I don't get the answers to these questions right, my dad won't like me as much. Now, this is a revelation. It didn't come as a big flashing light. It took a little time to work this out, but it was a revelation. Ava and her dad were seeing these things differently, and what that meant to Ava was that her dad was not intending to make it seem like he wouldn't like his daughter if she didn't get the answers to the questions. That wasn't his intention. And so what Ava thought was going on was not going on as far as her father was concerned. And so we talked about this, and that launched a revelation and a real process. The other thing that had happened in that session, when Ava's dad apologized to her, that apology is what I think of as anti-perfectionistic. Because basically the message to Ava when he did that was, I've made a mistake, but I think I can survive that, and I think we can put this on a different track. So basically he was saying, it's okay to make a mistake. He didn't say that in so many words, but he said, I goofed up, but we can fix this. We can make something different and better out of it. And for Ava, that is an anti-perfectionistic statement. A mistake is just a mistake. You don't want to make mistakes, and you want to do something about it when you do, but it's just a mistake. It's not a sign of a character flaw. That was one of the messages. So, what can we learn from this? Well, first we can learn it's a lot of pressure not to pressure your child. If you try to do this perfectly, you'll be in trouble. There are 4 things that came out of that session that I think are really important in helping kids, or adults for that matter, overcome perfectionism, and they all showed up in this session. The first of these, and they're not necessarily in any particular order, they're just all important. The first of these is empathy. And again, what I mean by that, that's our ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes. It's our ability to see the world through their eyes. So in order to understand what's going on with Ava so that we can help her, we have to understand what it means to her to be perfect. So why she wants to be perfect, if you want to ask the question that way. So what a mistake means to her. And again, for Ava, it means that, her father won't like her as well. So there needs to be some understanding of what the world means to the person who's perfectionistic in order for us to launch something different in their lives. The self-reflection is something that Ava's dad was capable of doing. This is difficult for most of us because it is a way of saying, I goofed. But for Ava's dad, it was a way of saying, I recognize that I played a role in this. And the powerful thing about that for him, and for many people under these circumstances, is that if we can say that for ourselves, then we can begin to see what we can do differently. And that's exactly what happened with Ava and her parents. So self-reflection here is very important. Do you play some kind of a role in your child's perfectionism? And so, for example, to sort of predict a question that may come up when we get to some questions here, if you have a child who struggles with assignments, and so they're the kind of kid who writes something down and no, it's no good, crumples the paper and throws it away. If you're the kind of person who I was when and this dates me, but with the color of my hair, it's not that big a surprise. I would sit in front of a typewriter. Anybody remember what those were? And when I was writing something, and I would wait for the first paragraph to be golden, and then I would type it. And no editing for me. So, again, everything has to be perfect, and it has to be, right the first time. And if you're that kind of a person, then obviously doing something like writing can become a great burden. And there was a long time when I didn't write, and that basically is the reason. It was so overwhelmingly burdensome that I couldn't get myself to do it. And if you see your child struggling with something like that, it might be interesting for you to say to your child, I notice that this is really difficult for you, and you seem to start things and then not be satisfied with it and throw it away. Can you tell me what it is that's going on for you? What are you feeling when that happens? You seem upset, but I'm not exactly sure what that is. Are you frustrated? Are you scared? Are you worried? And if your child says something like, I don't think it's right, and I have to get this right, then you might want to ask your child, does it seem to you that I think you need to get it right? And so be self-reflective and ask your child about this, and I think that can be a very powerful intervention. And maybe we'll talk more about that in a bit. The third element here is the encouragement process. This is also anti-perfectionistic. The encouragement process is a term that was used by Rudolf Dreikurs, a psychiatrist and parent educator in the middle of the last century, who used to talk about encouragement as the idea of telling kids what you like about them and what you appreciate about them, separate from what they can do. And so for a person like Ava, we can imagine her father saying to her, I really like how seriously you take your schoolwork. I like the effort that you put into it. It seems like that's really important to you, and that's very neat to see. None of that has anything to do with how well Ava is doing in school. All of it has to do with things that are honestly true about Ava and who she is, even with her perfectionism. Because, as you can see, there are some positive elements. Although perfectionism isn't a positive thing in and of itself, Ava is the kind of person who takes her work seriously and who puts a lot of energy and effort into it. And of course, if I could wave that magic wand and get rid of her perfectionism, it wouldn't actually change any of that. But she is that kind of person, and that's worth pointing out to her. So the encouragement process is telling your kids what you like about them and what you appreciate about them. And I had a supervisor many years ago who used to say, you can never overdose on encouragement. And the last element up here is the dialogue. This was an ongoing conversation that we had with Ava and her parents about what it is that was going on here. And the intention is to create a dialogue within this family so they can talk about what their feelings are about various things that are going on. And if Ava is frustrated about something or concerned about how she's doing, that she can talk to her parents about this along the lines of the conversation that we started in the therapeutic session, and that can be helpful to her in deciding what to do next, and can be helpful to her in understanding that she's acceptable as a person, because having that dialogue, the way I put that when I'm working with couples is that a dialogue like that is really an act of intimacy. Because in that session, Ava's dad was saying to Ava, you are important enough to me as a person that I will go out of my way to do something about this. That's the implicit message. And so this dialogue is very important. It's a dialogue between equals. It's between people who are mutually respectful of one another, and it's a very important part of this recovery process. And so what you're doing with all of these things is to launch a process that may take some time, and it may take some effort and some energy, but it's worth it. And what you're doing is basically pointing out to your children what you like about them, separate from what they can do. Now, again, to predict a question that typically comes up, it's perfectly okay to jump up and down if your child comes home with an A+. It's not like there's something wrong with that. You say, wow, that's wild, that's wonderful, and so on. The only thing that it's important to realize, though, is that when you have a lot of praise for how well your kids are doing in school, you run a risk. And the risk is that they will conclude that the reason you like them and the reason that you love them is because of how well they can do. And they could also come to some other conclusions about this. And Ava was about to come to this conclusion herself. The conclusion that she came to was, first of all, she was starting to do poorly in school, which was new for her, and was very fearful that her parents would be very upset with her about that. But the other thing is that Ava was beginning to come to the conclusion that because she wasn't able to do perfectly well in school, it meant that she wasn't gifted. And if that was the meaning that Ava imputed to that, then we have a rather severe self-esteem issue, because part of Ava's whole self-concept was of herself as having intellectual prowess, as being a gifted student. And now that was sort of crumbling before her eyes. And so, again, it's perfectly reasonable to tell your kids that you love it, that they're making straight A's and all that, and that's really cool. But it's also important to remember where they might be taking that, and so to put into the conversation somewhere, by the way, you know, I would love you just as much even if you weren't making straight A's. I just want to be clear about that. I think it's important to put that into the conversation. So that's what I think about perfectionism and where it comes from and what to do about it. We have a few minutes for questions, and so I'm going to wrap up with one of my all-time favorite quotes about the topic, and this comes from the jazz musician Ornette Coleman, the originator of free jazz, although he doesn't like to call it that. And apparently he said to somebody once, "It was when I found out I could make a mistake that I knew I was on to something." So I'm going to stop there and open the floor for questions and comments. Thank you. I hope everybody was clapping. Yes. I'll do that later.
That's also part of being a recovering perfectionist.
Yes.
So I'm also one of those. And you were talking about that it's not genetically caused, but it seems to be that if you tend to have this perfectionism in you, the kids pick it up anyway. So am I right in assuming that the best thing that you can do is go back and see this in yourself, so they don't have to repeat it for themselves? So if you sort of know and try to get, and not just with perfectionism, but with anything else, if you sort of become aware and work on it, will that take the pressure of them to do the things that you have to tell?
The answer to that question, did everybody hear that? If you see perfectionism in yourself, is it reasonable to do some work on yourself, and that can be helpful to your kids? I would go a step beyond that, actually. We had a question about this at NAGC once, and we had a really interesting conversation about it. If you see perfectionism in yourself, you're an expert on perfectionism. And so why not use that expertise with your child? Why not go and say, I see you struggling with this. I mean, whatever the scenario is, but I see you, trying to write this thing and it's no good, and you throw it away and so on. And when I look at you, I see myself in you. And here's how I think I was feeling back when I was doing the same thing. Are you feeling something like that? And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, maybe it's something different. But the point about that is that you can enter very powerfully into their world by sharing that experience with them. And of course, you're going to be saying, this is a struggle for me, and I would like to get beyond it. Why don't we work on this together, and we'll see what we can do. That's extremely powerful. That's an intimate act. That's an act of bonding with your child, which, again, that implicit message is right in there, that you're important enough to me and I love you enough to drag us both through this thing to see if we can do something different about it. But you are important to me and I do love you. That's the implicit message when you go to them with something like that. And incidentally, you don't have to know exactly what to say. You can say, I see this going on for you, and I'm not sure what it is, and I'm not sure, why it is that I do that, but I know that I do it, and so can we talk about this together? In other words, the conversation doesn't have to be perfect. And also, just one other point about that, while it's true that lots of times perfectionistic parents will have perfectionistic kids, that is not a demonstration of a genetic connection.
No, I know.
Yeah, because if... Right. And, it's not mystical either. Psychologically speaking, some of your kids will pick up on the fact that you have a lot of anxiety about making mistakes. And they'll start to wonder, is there something wrong with making a mistake? And that's where they'll conclude that there might be, and that's where the perfectionism comes from. So it's a pretty direct link. Yeah. Yes?
So now I realize that I've been wrong, I'm sure, because I don't think my kids are perfectionists. I get the difference between excellence, striving for excellence, and perfectionism, and it is the reaction to it. But I'm most curious that you said that there's no real proof of correlation, gifted kids have these issues. And I'm not really, I apologize, I don't know where my question really lies, but I see that my kids struggle because they are so gifted so often. So it is when something is not easy that they have to, so many things come so easily to them.
Yeah.
That it's when something doesn't, that they really don't know how to handle it. And it's not perfectionism per se, it's almost even a lack of desire to pursue excellence.
Well, yeah, I would wonder about that. So I don't know your kids, so I don't know, what precisely to say about that. But frequently, it's like what I was saying about Ava. So gifted kids, very powerfully gifted kids, can do a lot of things very easily. And of course, they get into the school system. Most of the stuff that's there, they can do very easily. Then they come up against something they have to put effort into, and it's like they don't want to do it. And so if that's the case, if that's what you're seeing, what I would want to know from them is what that's about. So how come it is that you get to something that's really difficult, and it seems like you don't want to do that, like you want to just not work and throw everything out the window? Because it could be, like I was saying about Ava, that they look at that and they say, if I'm gifted, I should be able to do this easily. That's been my experience my whole life. It's never been different than that. Now it's different, and I have to put effort into it, and maybe that means I'm not as gifted as I thought. And so there's a conversation to be had there about, so there's so many conversations to be had there. You're intellectually capable, and we want you to apply yourself to problems that are difficult. Ultimately, it'd be really neat if you would apply yourself to problems that nobody has been able to deal with before, because maybe you'll be able to make some headway here. There's also the argument about, we want these things to be difficult because we want you to stretch yourself. If you think about this more simply in terms of like playing tennis, if I'm your coach and I put you up against people who are not as good as you at tennis, you will never learn anything. But if I put you up against people who are better than you are at tennis at the moment, it's going to stretch you and you're going to grow, but in the same manner you are also going to lose some games. And that's the conversation to be had about that, and maybe there's something along those lines going on for your kids. Maybe they've gotten to the place where their natural assumption is, if I'm really bright, I should be able to do this easily. So it would be worth asking them about that. Yes?
Actually, I have two parts. The first part is I think sometimes it's more of a question of sometimes the kids give up a little too easily, and they don't get the opportunity to learn to overcome some hardship or challenges and difficulties. And that's something that we learn and not necessarily born with or innate. That's my point of the question. The second question really has to do with the example that you gave about Ava and her family. It sounds like she's in high school already.
Sounds like,
She's in high school,
yes.
right? So did they have to discover that this done much earlier in their years? Or did you have to wait like 10 years?
No, the question is, Ava's in high school. Could they have discovered about this, what I was calling a disjunction earlier? The answer to that is yes, but it's not likely, because earlier on in Ava's particular case, she was doing great. And so the question never came up. If it had, if she had gotten into some program or something as a younger kid and then started having a struggle, then it may have come up then. There's nothing prevented from coming up earlier. It's just that for Ava in particular, she sailed through school, and it was only when she got to high school that came crashing to a halt. The other question you're asking, if I get this right, I'm not quite sure I heard it all, but it was about giving up. Just giving up and walking away from something. The question I always have in my mind is, what's going on when a child gives up? And what that amounts to is what the particular task means to this child. They give up because it's too hard and they don't like putting in that much effort. Okay? They give up because they're afraid that they may not be able to do it well. Okay, that's a whole different deal, and now you know something about what that means to them, and you know something about what to do. So to me, the question always is, why and under what circumstances does the child give up? And it's important to understand that to be able to help them. Yes?
I have a question. I've been in this country now, there are a lot of children involved in games, computer games. And anybody having been, I know son, he was a straight-A student in 5th grade. When he got to the 6th grade, but he professional on games. And he's addicted to games. And he's not the only one in the school that he goes to. And then the school gives him a computer right home.
More games.
These children all the games.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's actually a question about perfectionism necessarily. Yeah. Well, so that could be all kinds of interesting things. I mean, if he really does well at games, first of all, The question was, so the kid is he's playing games on the computer a lot, and he's really, really good at it, and he's a perfectionist when it comes to playing games on the computer. But sooner or later, everything else in his life gets lost, and then he goes to school, and he was saying they send him home with a computer, and that just makes, for more availability of games, and he spends his life doing that, and how do we get him past that? So, there could be all kinds of answers to that, but certainly one thing we want to recognize in a situation like that is that this is a kid who is really good at doing certain things. And it's not just at winning the game. It's about paying attention to something for extended periods of time. It's about figuring things out, and usually about figuring them out fairly quickly, and a lot of complex rules that apparently he can pick up and learn fairly quickly and do fairly well. So you want to be affirming about that. And if you're affirming about that, and he feels like he's being affirmed and supported by you, it's going to be easier for you to say, we need to talk about the amount of time you're spending playing games. I think it's wonderful you can do this, but as I look at this, there are other things in your life that are starting to fall apart, and of course the farther in school you go, the more likely that is going to happen. So can we talk about this? And so you do it from that point of view, rather than saying, okay, you can't have the games anymore. I mean, that's just going to cause a big fight, and that's not going to do anybody any good. So I would start from that point of view, because, there are a lot of kids who play games a lot on the computer and then go on to program these games and actually earn a living that way. And that's a good thing. Did they waste their lives? Well, not in that case. Maybe in some other cases it would be. But you're in a much better position to have a conversation with your child about, look, I think you're spending too much time playing games. If they feel okay about themselves and they feel like they have the possibility of being okay in other areas other than just the games. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. So, yeah. Yes?
Wondering if you can help me out in motivating my child. Like a lot of people do, brilliant. So I have a very active kid. She's playing everything, very active. As soon as I put up a math problem to practice on, she's like, I'm tired. and so I know it comes down to her not wanting to fail. I've seen it over and over again. But what can I do, or what phrase, or what can I say to just motivate her to give it a try? It's okay if you fail, just give it a try. She would just say, I'm tired.
So the conversation about that starts with, okay, so you say you're tired. How else are you feeling? What is it that's going on? Because it seems to me that you get tired in a big hurry when this comes up. And so it seems to me there may be some other things going on, and I seriously am interested in knowing what this is. And she might say to you, well, I'm afraid I'm going to do these things and they'll fail. She might also, by the way, say to you, you know what, I do math at school, I don't want to do it here. And if she ends up saying that, then depending on what your intention is, you might want to have a conversation with her about why you feel it's important for her to learn math at home or to practice it there or whatever. Now, if what you're saying is that even in school it's difficult for her to do the math because she's worried that she won't do it right, then that's the issue that you want to address. And then you'll be talking to her about, okay, so you're telling me it seems to you won't be able to do it right, and then what? So suppose you make a mistake. What do you think people will think? What do you think I'll think about that? What do you think the teacher will think about that? And that launches your conversation, depending on what she says about that. by the way, one other thing about that, some of these conversations that I'm talking about, you realize, and I'm sure many of you in the room do realize this, sometimes you'll start conversations like this and your basic role as a parent is sort of float things out there on the water, because sometimes your kid will say, whatever. And you might then end up saying to them, okay, well, I'm just wondering about that, and I'm wondering if you would think about it, and so maybe we'll talk about it again in a little while. And then I would drop it, and then in a few days I would come back to it and say, have you been thinking about this? Because kids don't always want to talk about something on the spot, and sometimes it's because they're embarrassed. And so you want to let that sort of subside and then come back to it. So it's just another little technical detail about those conversations. I think you had a question.
What is mother's doing? And I guess part B is her grades getting better.
Much better, and yes. Yeah, this is some time ago already, and Ava ended up recovering and doing fine, as did her mother. Her mother was working pretty hard on the whole deal about depression. That had something to do with the relationship between her and her husband. It was very complicated. We worked through all of that, and ultimately over time things did get better. So that really is a success story. Not all stories like that are success stories, but that one was. So, yeah. Okay, I think we'll take one more question, and then I think we need to, because they're going to throw us out of here soon. Yes? Yeah. Yes? Okay.
I just have a really quick question. Coming from a family along the way of not being perfectionist, in different ways, and all very high achievers in different ways, creatively, academically, in different ways. However, I feel that there's an aspect of drive, of self-drive, intrinsic drive with perfectionism. Although there's definitely all of these negative, destructive things that we have to overcome and recover from as perfectionists. And speaking as a perfectionist myself who suffers every day with it, I feel that if I didn't have it, I would never be successful and I would never have achieved anything I've achieved in my life. So I'm just confused, like, how do I value my perfectionism? Do I get rid of it? And do I say, I'm just going to do a half-like job? I'm obviously not in recovery yet, but...
So join the club and welcome.
Value in perfectionism?
No. I'm not trying to be glib about it, but no, there isn't. It's all about anxiety. And you're not talking about perfectionism when you're talking about what you call your drive. What you experience as your drive is your intention to do well. And what you're experiencing in terms of your success is what I was saying about your talent and your energy and your commitment. And if your perfectionism went away, none of that would change. It would all still be there. It seems to you that if the perfectionism went away, you would deflate and nothing would get done. Yeah, and I get that, and that's one of the things that makes it difficult to deal with perfectionism is because of the fear of losing that, and ultimately that comes down to, if I'm not perfect, then I'm not acceptable. And so that's what makes this difficult. It's what makes it impossible for me to say to a perfectionist, well, let's do this exercise, let's go out and have you make a mistake on purpose, and we'll talk about how that feels and everything, because they're going to go out and try to do the exercise perfectly. And so I'm, firing up the perfectionism while I'm trying to get rid of it. I get that. It's a real dilemma. But again, I'd like you to be thinking along those lines. And by the way, the internal drive that you feel doesn't arise in a vacuum. It feels like it comes from inside you. But the drive that you have, if you are perfectionistic, is really an intention to make yourself perfect so you can be acceptable.
I agree with you. And I have 4 children, and I actually do a lot of what you said with my children because I know that it's very painful, and they're actually very successful without it. But in myself, I still can't let go, but thank you very much.
It's a recovery process. Keep at it. Thank you.